The sun of planet Kara hung low in the bruised sky, painting the horizon in shades of orange and deep violet that seemed to bleed into one another like wounds refusing to close. Marlene stood motionless in a lake of blue blood that reached past his knees, the viscous liquid steaming in the cooling evening air and releasing vapors that stung his nostrils with their acrid chemical bite. Around him sprawled the massive corpse of a six-legged thunderer, a creature whose hide was worth more than most settlers earned in a standard year. The beast had fought hard before dying, its final moments spent thrashing and roaring, tearing up the rocky ground in desperate fury. Now it lay still, just another carcass in a long line of kills that stretched back through 7 brutal years on this alien world. Marlene drove his long hunting knife into the thick membrane behind the creature's massive shoulder joint, his movements as methodical and precise as a surgeon performing a familiar operation. The blade was his own work, forged from salvaged metal and sharpened to an edge that could split hair, a tool that had saved his life more times than he could count. He began the careful work of peeling back the valuable pelt, each stroke of the blade separating skin from muscle with minimal waste. The hide had to be perfect to fetch top price, and Marlin had learned long ago that precision paid better than speed. His hands moved with the confidence of thousands of previous kills, finding the natural separation points in the beast's anatomy without conscious thought. Swarms of insects descended on the fresh kill like a living cloud, their bodies the size of his thumb, and their wings producing a droning hum that set his teeth on edge. They landed on his exposed forearms, their mandibles piercing his weathered skin and drawing blood. Each bite delivered a burning sensation that would itch for days, leaving welts that marked him as a hunter who worked in the wilderness rather than the safety of the settlements. Marlin ignored them completely, his mind focused solely on the task at hand. Pain was just information, his body reporting damage that either required immediate attention or could be dealt with later. Right now, these bites fell firmly into the latter category. He had learned to categorize discomfort the way other men categorize coins, and most of it simply wasn't worth spending attention on. 20 meters away, keeping a careful distance that spoke of both respect and fear, a group of Karen traders waited with their hover sleds loaded with supplies and empty containers ready to receive his harvest. They were natives of this world, their skin the characteristic blue of their species, ranging from deep cobalt to pale azure depending on lineage and clan. Their skulls were elongated, giving them a perpetually thoughtful appearance, and their hands bore only 3 fingers, but moved with surprising dexterity. They spoke among themselves in the clicking, whistling language of their people, the sounds carrying clearly across the open ground. Marlin caught fragments of their conversation even without understanding the specific words. They were placing bets, as they always did, wagering on whether the human would survive his next hunt or finally fall victim to the planet that had killed so many of his kind. To the Karens, Marlene was an anomaly that challenged their understanding of the natural order. He was a pale-skinned predator who had somehow not just survived, but thrived on their deadly world for 7 full years. 7 years of facing creatures that routinely killed their best hunters. 7 years of enduring weather that could freeze blood or boil skin. 7 years of eating food that should have poisoned his alien biology. Yet here he stood, methodically butchering a thunderer that had killed 3 of their champions just last season. His presence in their world made them uncomfortable, a reminder that the universe was larger and more dangerous than their ancestors had believed. They whispered when he passed, calling him ghost and demon, and worse things. But they always paid his price. The thunderer had been a magnificent specimen, its 6 legs each as thick as ancient tree trunks, and its hide tough enough to turn aside most conventional weapons. It had taken Marlin 3 days to track it to this rocky valley, following signs that would have been invisible to untrained eyes. Another 2 days of careful stalking to get into position. Then came the moment of the kill, a single arrow placed with perfect precision into the soft tissue behind the skull where bone plates met. The creature had run for nearly a kilometer before its massive heart finally gave out, and Marlene had followed the trail of blue blood patiently, knowing that haste would only waste energy. When he'd finally caught up to the dying beast, it had taken another hour of careful work with his spear to finish what the arrow had started. Nothing about hunting on Kara was quick or easy, but Marlene had never expected it to be. He finished his butchering as the sun touched the horizon, its light turning from gold to deep amber. The meat he would dry and smoke for his own consumption, though Thunderer flesh was tough and bitter even when properly prepared. The organs he would sell to the medicinal traders who valued certain glands for their chemical properties. The bones would go to craftsmen who carved them into tools and decorative items. But the hide, the beautiful blue-gray hide marked with natural patterns like frozen lightning, that was the real prize. He wrapped it carefully in treated cloth that would protect it from the elements, then hoisted the heavy bundle onto his shoulder with a grunt of effort that sent fresh pain shooting through his back muscles. The walk to the traders was short, but felt longer under the weight of his harvest. Marlene's body ached from the days of tracking and the hours of butchering, his muscles tight and protesting, but he kept his face neutral and his stride steady. Never show weakness to anyone who might use it against you. That was survival rule number 3, and it had kept him alive when stronger men had died. The Karens watched his approach with their large eyes that seemed to see everything, their expressions unreadable by human standards, but their body language speaking volumes to someone who had learned to read it. The transaction proceeded in silence. One of the traders, an older male whose skin had faded to pale blue with age, ran his scanning device over the hide, the machine humming as it analyzed quality and authenticity. Numbers appeared on a small display, and the trader's face remained impassive as he verified that this was indeed premium-grade material. He transferred the agreed payment to Marlene's worn data chip, a small piece of technology that represented one of the few concessions he made to civilization. Credits appeared in his account, enough to buy supplies for another month, maybe 2 if he was careful. The trader said something in his own language that might have been a blessing or a curse. Marlene had never bothered to learn which. And then the group departed on their hover sleds, kicking up dust as they headed back toward the distant settlements. Marlene stood alone in the gathering darkness, watching them go until they were just lights in the distance. Then he turned and made his way toward the rocky outcrop where he'd established his temporary camp. The planet's geography was harsh and unforgiving, all sharp angles and treacherous footing, but Marlene navigated it with the easy confidence of long familiarity. This was his territory now, earned through blood and sweat in the stubborn refusal to die that seemed to define his existence. Other humans came to Kara seeking fortune or adventure or escape, but most of them left in boxes or simply vanished into the wilderness. Their names added to the long list of those who had failed to adapt. Marlene had adapted. He'd stripped away every soft civilian habit, every assumption about how the world should work, and rebuilt himself into something that could survive here. He'd become a predator in a world full of predators, and he'd learned to be better at it than most. His camp was simple, just a circle of stones for a fire and a small shelter made from local materials that would keep off the worst of the weather. Marlene had learned early that elaborate camps just attracted attention from things that were curious or hungry or both. Better to stay small, stay mobile, stay ready to move at a moment's notice. He'd survived 7 years by never getting too comfortable, never assuming he was safe, never forgetting that this planet wanted him dead just as much as any predator that walked its surface. He built his fire with practiced efficiency, arranging kindling and fuel in a pattern that would burn hot and clean. Once the flames were crackling steadily, he skewered strips of Thunderer meat on a simple spit fashioned from green wood that wouldn't burn too quickly. The flesh sizzled as it cooked, fat dripping into the fire and sending up small flares of light. The smell was strong and gamey, not pleasant by Earth standards, but Marlene's stomach had learned to accept what this world provided. He'd eaten worse. He'd eaten things that would have made his old self vomit just from the appearance. But hunger was a powerful teacher, and his body had adapted to alien biochemistry through sheer stubborn necessity. Around him, the sounds of Kara's night began to rise, like an orchestra tuning before a performance. Howls echoed from distant hills, some high-pitched and frantic, others deep enough to vibrate in his chest. Clicks and whistles came from the crystalline forests where things hunted in the darkness using senses humans didn't possess. The distant roar of something massive moving through the underbrush, probably a boulder beast marking its territory. These sounds had terrified him during his first months on the planet, keeping him awake and jumpy, his hand never leaving his weapon. Now they were just background noise, familiar as breathing, each one cataloged in his mind according to threat level and distance. Most humans who came here never made it past the terror phase. They heard these sounds and their primitive brains screamed at them to run, to hide, to curl up and wait for rescue that would never come. Marlene had pushed through the terror and found something else on the other side. Not courage exactly, more like cold acceptance. The planet was going to keep making these sounds whether he was afraid or not, so fear was just wasted energy. He was halfway through his meal when he felt it, that subtle shift in the environment that warned of approaching presence. The insects changed their pitch slightly. A small nocturnal creature that had been chittering in a nearby bush went suddenly silent. The hackles rose on the back of Marlene's neck, an ancient warning system that predators were still predators no matter what world they came from. His hand moved automatically to the knife at his belt, his body coiling into readiness without conscious thought. 7 years of survival had wired these responses deep into his nervous system. Assess, adapt, act, never freeze. Freezing was death. The figure emerged from behind a cluster of thorn bushes, moving with the careful steps of someone who understood that sudden movements could be fatal. Marlene's grip on his knife relaxed fractionally, but didn't release. The newcomer was small, child-sized, and as they stepped into the firelight, he could see the pale blue skin that marked them as Karen, female, young, perhaps 5 years old by human equivalency, though aging was different between species. Her black hair was woven into elaborate braids that identified her as royalty, the complex patterns marking her family line and status. But those braids were matted with mud and what looked like dried blood, both blue and some other darker color. She wore the remnants of ceremonial robes that had once been magnificent, but were now torn and stained beyond recognition. What struck Marlene most, what made him actually pause and study her, rather than simply sending her away, were her eyes. They held no fear, which was unusual enough for a child alone in the wilderness. But more than that, they held no hope either. These were eyes that had already looked death in the face and found it familiar. Eyes that had seen things no child should see and survived with something fundamental broken inside. Marlene recognized that look because he'd seen it in his own reflection often enough. This was a survivor, someone who had already paid the price that survival demanded. She walked straight to his fire without asking permission, sat down cross-legged on the opposite side with movements that were far too controlled and deliberate for someone her age, and stared at him with those flat, assessing eyes. This was not a child seeking comfort or rescue. This was someone conducting an evaluation, weighing his worth against her needs. The silence stretched between them, while the fire crackled and the night sounds of Kara continued their endless song. Marlene took another bite of his meat, chewed slowly, and swallowed before speaking. No reason to waste food on conversation. "You're a long way from any settlement, girl," he said finally, his voice roughened from days without using it. He spoke in trade speak, the common language that mixed elements from a dozen species and served as lingua franca across the sector. "I am where I need to be," she replied, her accent marking her as educated, despite her apparent age. "You are Marlene the Hunter. They call you the Pale Ghost in the settlements. They say you cannot be killed because you are already dead, a spirit sent to haunt this world." "They're wrong," Marlene said flatly. "Everything can be killed. I just haven't met the thing that can do it yet." "Good," the girl said, and reached into her torn robes. She pulled out a heavy hoop of metal, perhaps 15 centimeters in diameter, its surface covered in intricate patterns that had been carved with exceptional skill. Even in the firelight, Marlene could see the quality of the metalwork. This was precious stuff, rare enough on Kara to be worth a small fortune, worth enough to buy passage off this planet and start over somewhere safer. She held it out toward him across the fire, her small hands steady. "You kill animals for money," she said, her thin voice carrying the kind of firmness that suggested she'd prepared this speech carefully. "But will you kill the devil for the truth? My uncle murdered the sky in my eyes. He killed my father while I watched from beneath the table where my nurse had hidden me. He killed my mother while she begged for my life. He killed my 3 brothers, even the baby who couldn't walk yet. He made my people slaves to darkness, ruling through fear and pain and death. He searches for me now because alive I represent a threat to his stolen throne. When his warriors find me, I will die slowly to serve as an example." She spoke about her death the way Marlene spoke about his next hunt, as a simple statement of probable fact rather than something to fear or mourn. The casualness of it was more disturbing than tears would have been. Marlene studied her face, looking for deception or madness or anything that would suggest this was a trap. He found nothing but brutal honesty. This child had watched her family die. She was being hunted by forces she couldn't fight. She had maybe days before those forces found her, and somehow she tracked down the most dangerous human on the planet to make him an offer. He looked at the hoop, its value tempting, then back at the fire. Then he picked up the metal circlet and examined it more closely. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, the kind of work that took years to master. The patterns weren't just decorative, they told a story in the pictographic language of old Karen nobility, a family line stretching back generations, a promise of loyalty and service, a bond of trust that was supposed to be unbreakable. Marlene tossed the hoop back to her. It landed in the dust at her feet with a soft thump, raising a small cloud of ash. "I don't take payment from orphans," he said, his voice flat as winterstone. For the first time, something flickered in those dead eyes. Confusion, perhaps, or maybe the faint stirring of hope that she'd tried to strangle but couldn't quite kill. She stared at the hoop, then back at him, trying to understand what was happening. In her world, everyone wanted payment. Everyone had a price. Acts of charity were weaknesses that got you killed. Yet here was this human, this alien predator, refusing wealth that could change his life. "Show me the way," Marlene said, settling back against his rock. "Tell me about your uncle's forces, his defenses, his habits. Tell me everything that might keep me alive long enough to kill him." Rubena picked up the hoop slowly, her fingers closing around it as if testing whether this moment was real or another hallucination brought on by exhaustion and fear. Then she tucked it back into her robes and began to speak, her young voice recounting horrors that would have broken most adults. She told him about her uncle Korvax, who had been her father's trusted general before betrayal. She described the night of blood when loyal guards were murdered in their sleep, and the palace became a slaughterhouse. She explained the military structure of his forces, the positions of his fortifications, the patterns of his patrols. She had observed everything with the careful eye of someone who knew she might need this information to survive. Marlin listened without interrupting, filing away every detail in the methodical way he tracked prey. By the time she finished, the fire had burned low and the moon had risen, casting pale blue light across the broken landscape. He understood now what he was facing. Not just a simple assassination of some petty warlord. This was going to require a journey across hostile territory, through multiple defensive perimeters, against an enemy who commanded professional soldiers and had the advantage of fortified positions. The smart move would be to refuse, to send the girl away and forget this conversation ever happened. But Marlin had stopped making smart moves when he decided to stay on Kara 7 years ago. And there was something about this child, this tiny broken thing who had survived when everything tried to kill her, that resonated with something deep in his own damaged psyche. He didn't examine that feeling too closely. Self-knowledge was overrated. "Get some sleep," he said finally. "We leave before first light. Once we start this, we don't stop until your uncle's dead, or we are." Rubena nodded once, that too-adult gesture again, and curled up on the opposite side of the fire. Within minutes, her breathing deepened into sleep, exhaustion finally claiming what fear had kept awake. Marlene watched her for a while, this small blue child who had hired him to kill a devil, then turned his attention back to the darkness. Sleep would come when it came. Right now he needed to think. The next hours were spent in careful preparation, the kind of methodical planning that separated survivors from corpses. Marlene examined each piece of his equipment with critical eyes, weighing value against burden. His heavy shoulder guards, reinforced with metal plates he'd salvaged and shaped himself, went into a cache he'd hidden nearby. They'd saved his life twice but weighed 5 kilos and made noise when he moved. The thick belt laden with traps and snares, tools that had served him well hunting beasts, was stripped down to essentials. The reinforced bracers that protected his forearms got wrapped in oiled cloth and stored away. Each piece represented months of work, equipment he'd earned through hard hunts and harder lessons. Setting them aside felt like shedding parts of himself. What remained was frighteningly minimal. His leather jacket, light and flexible, scored and patched from countless encounters, its surface stained with old blood from a dozen different species. His recurved bow, handmade from the flexible bone of a marsh creature he'd killed in his second year, stronger and more reliable than anything the trader sold. The bow had been cut from a single piece of spine, shaped over months of patient work, its curve perfect for generating maximum power with minimum draw weight. His quiver held 20 arrows, each one a small work of craftsmanship. The shafts were straight willow taken from the river valleys, lightweight but strong. The fletching came from blue prairie runners, birds that could reach incredible speeds, their feathers providing stability in flight. The arrowheads were napped stone, obsidian that he learned to work using ancient techniques, each one sharp enough to slice paper and strong enough to punch through Karen armor if you knew where to aim. 2 knives went into his belt. The long knife was his primary tool, 30 centimeters of salvaged steel that he'd forged himself in a makeshift foundry, its edge maintained with religious devotion. The short knife was his backup, 15 centimeters of pure utility, used for everything from field dressing kills to eating his meals. Both had handles wrapped in treated leather that wouldn't slip even when covered in blood. Everything else he left behind. The cooking gear, the spare boots, the medical supplies beyond basic bandages, the tools for making fire. All of it cached in various hiding spots he maintained throughout his territory. If he survived, he could come back for it. If he didn't, it wouldn't matter. Ruben awoke as the first hints of dawn colored the eastern sky, coming alert instantly without the confusion that usually marked children waking in strange places. She watched him check his equipment one final time, her eyes tracking each movement. "You leave your armor behind?" she asked, her voice still rough with sleep. "Weight kills faster than enemies," Marlene replied, testing the draw on his bow one more time. The string was braided gut from 3 different predators, each strand contributing different properties. It stretched smoothly, released cleanly. "Good. Your uncle's men trust their metal and their numbers. That makes them predictable. Heavy armor means they can't move quietly, can't pursue for long distances, can't adapt quickly. We're going to move like wind, like shadows, like things they don't have words for. Speed is armor. Distance is armor. Being where they aren't expecting is better armor than any metal." He looked at her directly, his pale eyes meeting her blue ones. "Can you run without stopping?" "Yes," she said simply. "Can you stay quiet when you want to scream?" "Yes." "Can you keep up without complaining when your feet bleed and your lungs burn and every muscle in your body begs you to stop?" She didn't answer with words. She simply stood, squared her small shoulders in a gesture that was far too adult, and waited. Marlene felt something that might have been respect. This child had steel in her spine. Good. The journey ahead would test that steel until it either broke or became something stronger. They left the camp as the moon set and the sun began its climb. Marlene moved with fluid silence born from thousands of hours hunting things that had better senses than he did. Rubena followed, her small feet finding the same paths his did, learning the rhythm of his movements. He didn't slow for her, didn't offer to carry her, didn't make any concessions to her age or size. That would teach her nothing except dependence, and dependence was death. Instead, he set a pace she could match and let necessity be her instructor. If she fell behind, she'd learn to go faster. If she made noise, she'd learn to be quieter. The planet was a harsh teacher, but an effective one. The rocky badlands gave way to different terrain as they traveled, the ground becoming softer, the vegetation denser. The wild jungles began where the open land ended, a wall of growth so thick it seemed impossible to penetrate. The transition was sharp enough to be disorienting, like stepping from one world directly into another. The air changed too, becoming humid and heavy, laden with the scent of rot and growth happening simultaneously. This was where things grew fast and died faster, where the competition for sunlight and nutrients was so fierce that evolution had turned every plant into a weapon. Marlene had hunted in these jungles before, tracking prey that used the dense growth as cover. He knew the ways in, the paths that only revealed themselves if you understood how to read the land. The plants here weren't passive, they were aggressive and responsive. Their root systems functioned as a distributed nervous system, detecting vibrations through the ground and reacting to potential threats. Step too heavily or move too quickly, and vines would coil, thorns would extend, flowers would release clouds of irritant pollen. The jungle protected itself, and it didn't care if you were predator or prey. At the jungle's edge, Marlene knelt beside Rubena, bringing himself down to her eye level. The undergrowth here was thick, everything fighting for space, and ahead he could see the first of the reactive plants, their leaves already trembling slightly as they detected the vibrations of their approach. "Watch carefully," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "This isn't something I can explain with words. Your body has to learn it." He demonstrated the hunter's step, placing his foot down with exquisite slowness, transferring his weight gradually from heel to toe, allowing the ground to accept it without sudden pressure that would trigger the plant's defensive responses. The nearby vegetation trembled slightly, its root system detecting the disturbance. But the movement was gentle enough that it didn't cross the threshold into threat. The plants relaxed back into their neutral state. Marlin took another step, the same careful rolling motion, the same slow transfer of weight. Again, the plants trembled and relaxed. "Your turn," he said. "Remember, it's not about being light, it's about being gradual. The plants respond to sudden changes, not to absolute weight. A bolder beast can walk through here if it moves slowly enough." Rubena attempted to copy his movement. Her first try was too quick, her foot coming down in a motion that was controlled but not gradual enough. A nearby vine plant coiled defensively, its thorns extending toward her ankle. Marlin's hand shot out and caught her shoulder before she could instinctively step back. Stepping back would just trigger more plants and start a cascade reaction that would leave them both covered in cuts. "Don't react," he said softly. "Freeze exactly where you are. Let it settle." They stood motionless. Rubena balanced awkwardly on one foot, the vine plant poised and tense. 30 seconds passed, feeling much longer, before the plant slowly relaxed and retracted its thorns. The immediate threat had passed without escalating. "Again," Marlin said, "slower this time. Think of it like lowering yourself into water. You don't want to make waves." Her second attempt was better, but still triggered a response from a different plant. They froze again, waited, continued. Third attempt, fourth, fifth. Each time she improved incrementally, her young nervous system adapting with the speed that children possessed, finding the rhythm through trial and error. By her 10th attempt, she'd managed 3 steps without triggering any defensive responses. "Good," Marlin said. "Now do it 1,000 more times until your body knows it without thinking." They moved into the jungle using the hunter's step, their progress measured in meters per hour rather than kilometers. The dense growth pressed in around them, creating a twilight world even though the sun shone bright overhead. Bioluminescent fungi provided ghostly blue-green light in the deeper shadows, their glow beautiful and probably poisonous. Strange calls echoed through the canopy above, the sounds of creatures moving through the branches, most of which Marlin had never seen and hoped he never would. Some sounds were familiar, cataloged in his mental database of things that might try to kill him. Others were new, and new sounds meant unknown dangers. The jungle air was thick enough to taste, heavy with moisture and the complex chemistry of millions of plants competing and cooperating in the eternal dance of survival. Every surface dripped with condensation. Every breath felt like drinking rather than breathing. Marlin's clothes were soaked within the first hour, clinging to his skin uncomfortably. But discomfort was just another sensation to be ignored. Rubena struggled more, her smaller body working harder to maintain the careful, controlled movements. But she never complained, never asked to rest, never gave any sign that she wanted to stop. Twice during that first day in the jungle, Marlene raised his hand in the signal to freeze, and they became living statues while something large moved nearby. The first time it was a dawn stalker, a predator that hunted by detecting vibration through the jungle floor. It passed within 5 meters of them, its massive body crushing vegetation as it moved, its breathing a wet, rattling sound that suggested diseased lungs. Marlene and Rubena remained frozen for the 15 minutes it took for the creature to pass and leave its territory range, knowing that any movement would draw its attention and that fighting such a creature in dense jungle would be suicide. The second time it was worse. A pack of skitter claws, small pack hunters that moved through the mid-canopy and dropped on prey from above. Marlin heard them before he saw them, the distinctive clicking sound they made to coordinate attacks. He pulled Rubena against a massive tree trunk, and they pressed themselves flat, becoming part of the bark pattern, not daring to breathe deeply. The skitter claws passed overhead in a group of perhaps 20 individuals, their many-legged bodies moving with horrifying speed across branches and vines. One paused directly above them, its antennae twitching as it tested the air. Marlene's hand was on his knife, ready to fight if discovered. But after a moment that felt like an hour, the creature continued on, following its packmates toward some prey they detected elsewhere. When the sounds of the pack faded into the distance, Rubena let out a breath she'd been holding. What were those things? Skitter claws, Marlin said, relaxing fractionally but not moving yet. Pack hunters, drop on prey from above, inject paralyzing venom, then eat while you're still alive to feel it. They can strip a thunderer to bones in under an hour. Have you fought them before? Once. Killed 3 before I managed to run far enough that they gave up the chase. Lost 2 fingers on my left hand to their venom before I could cut away the affected tissue. He held up his left hand, showing where his ring and little fingers ended at the first knuckle. Don't fight packs unless you have no choice. Pack hunters trade individual weakness for overwhelming numbers. You might kill 5, 10, even 15, but the rest will kill you. They continued through the jungle, the light fading as the sun set and darkness turned the world into something from a fever dream. Marlene found a relatively safe spot to rest, a natural hollow in a massive tree root system that provided some protection from above and limited the approach angles for ground predators. They ate in silence, sharing the dried thunderer meat and water from Marlin's canteen. The water was warm and tasted of the treated leather of the canteen, but it was clean, and that was all that mattered. How long will it take to reach the citadel? Rubena asked as they settled in for the night, the jungle's nocturnal chorus beginning around them. Depends on how many times we have to stop or detour around threats, Marlene replied, checking his arrows for damage by feel in the dim light. We're moving slow through the jungle because fast gets you killed. Once we clear it, maybe 3 days to the river, another 2 days to the mountains. Then depends on patrols and how aggressive your uncle searches. They'll be very aggressive. Korvax doesn't tolerate loose ends. He'll have his best hunters tracking me. Good, Marlene said, and she looked at him with surprise. Hunters following specific orders are predictable. Predictable enemies can be manipulated. He didn't elaborate, and she didn't press. They slept in shifts, each keeping watch while the other rested. Though Marlene noticed that Rubena's definition of sleep was as troubled as his own. She would doze but never truly surrender to unconsciousness, always half alert to danger. He understood that. True sleep was a luxury that survivors learned to do without. The second day in the jungle brought new challenges. The terrain changed, becoming wetter, the ground turning it to a maze of pools and streams that hid numerous dangers. Marlene knew from experience that water in the jungle was never just water. It was ecosystem, habitat, hunting ground, and death trap all at once. He tested each crossing carefully before committing, watching for ripples that indicated something waiting below, checking for the telltale shimmer of certain aquatic predators' scales. They were crossing a relatively wide stream, the water coming up to Marlene's thighs and Rubena's chest, when he saw the shadow moving beneath the surface. He froze mid-step and grabbed Rubena's shoulder, stopping her movement. She froze too, her growing trust in his reactions evident in her immediate response. The shadow resolved into something with too many fins and too many teeth, a river hunter that moved like liquid death through the murky water. It circled them lazily, evaluating, deciding whether they were prey or something more dangerous. Marlene's hand moved slowly to his knife, the motion controlled enough not to create ripples. The creature completed another circle, coming closer this time, its body now visible just beneath the surface. It was easily 3 meters long, built for sudden acceleration and devastating strikes. Marlene waited, knife ready, every muscle tense. The creature made another pass, then a fourth. On its fifth circle, it seemed to reach a decision. With a sudden burst of speed, it shot toward Rubina, its jaws opening to reveal rings of serrated teeth. Marlin's blade flashed down. He'd been tracking the creature's movements, predicting its attack angle, and his knife met its skull at the optimal intercept point. The blade punched through bone and into brain matter, the force of the creature's own charge driving the weapon home. The river hunter's momentum carried it past them, already dead, but its body not knowing it yet. Marlene pulled his knife free as the creature tumbled past, its blood mixing with the stream water in dark clouds. "Move," he said quietly. "Where there's one, there's usually more, and blood brings them faster." They crossed the rest of the stream quickly, abandoning caution for speed, and didn't stop until they were well clear of the water. Marlene cleaned his blade on moss, checking the edge carefully. The skull had been harder than expected, and he could feel a tiny chip in the metal. He'd need to sharpen it tonight, restoring the edge to perfection. "You moved before I saw it," Rubina said, looking at him with something that might have been awe. "I've spent 7 years learning to read this planet," Marlene replied, working his blade over a small whetstone he carried. The water moved wrong. The light reflected at an angle that suggested something large beneath the surface. The other small fish in the area had gone quiet. "Put it together and you know something's hunting before you see it. Can you teach me to see those things? I can tell you what to look for. The rest comes from experience, and experience comes from not dying long enough to learn." They continued through the jungle, Rubina's eyes now more active, trying to spot the signs Marlene had described. She wouldn't learn it quickly, but the fact that she was trying spoke well of her chances. Too many people went through dangerous environments without really seeing them, trusting to luck or divine favor or simple ignorance. Those people became statistics. By evening of the second day, Marlene caught the first signs that they were being tracked. Broken vegetation that hadn't been disturbed by animals. A boot print in soft earth near a stream, too fresh to be old patrol patterns. The faint chemical scent of alien body armor, carried on the wind from something upwind of them. Korvac's hunters had picked up their trail, probably following the disturbance they'd left in the reactive plants, and were closing the distance. Marlene allowed himself a cold smile. Good. Time to turn hunters into prey. He found a suitable location where the jungle opened into a small clearing, dominated by a twisted tree that seemed to have grown in defiance of all natural laws. Its branches spread in impossible directions, and hanging from its central trunk was a massive structure that looked like a cocoon, but pulsed with internal movement. Marlene recognized it immediately. Desert wasp nest, one of the imports that had been brought to Kara during early colonization attempts, and had promptly escaped to breed and evolve into something far more aggressive than their genetic ancestors. Their venom could drop a thunderer in minutes, causing paralysis followed by respiratory failure, and they defended their nests with suicidal ferocity. Marlin began laying false trails, making his tracks obvious in ways that suggested desperate haste. He broke branches at chest height, scuffed dirt in patterns that indicated running rather than careful movement, even left a piece of torn cloth caught on thorns. The trail led directly toward the clearing and the nest tree. "Stay here," he told Rubina, positioning her behind a dense tangle of roots where she'd be protected from multiple angles. "Don't move, don't make sound. No matter what you hear, no matter what you see, you stay hidden and silent until I come get you. Understand?" "Yes," she said, her face serious as she absorbed the gravity of his tone. "If something happens to me, if I don't come back, you keep moving west. 3 days west brings you to mining settlements. Tell them who you are. Demand shelter in your father's name. Some will remember their loyalty." "You'll come back," she said with the absolute certainty of someone who needed to believe it. "Probably," Marlene agreed, "but plans that assume success are how good people die." He climbed a nearby tree with careful efficiency, finding a position with clear sight lines to the clearing and the nest. The tree he'd chosen was downwind of the nest, so the wasps wouldn't be agitated by his scent. His perch was comfortable enough, a thick branch that would support his weight without creaking. He knocked an arrow, tested the draw one more time, and settled in to wait. The hunter's greatest weapon was always patience. The elite guard arrived perhaps 2 hours later as afternoon light filtered through the jungle canopy in shafts of golden green. 6 warriors moved in practiced formation, their armor made from segmented blue metal that marked them as professional soldiers rather than common guards. They wore the crest of Korvax's personal forces, a stylized predator that was supposed to inspire fear. Their weapons were quality work, curved swords designed for close combat and short spears optimized for throwing. These weren't conscripts or thugs, these were career warriors who had trained for years and survived numerous battles. Their leader was a scarred veteran whose cold eyes scanned the environment constantly, missing nothing, a commander who had kept his people alive through competence rather than luck. They followed Marlene's false trail exactly as he'd intended, reading the signs and interpreting them as proof that their quarry was panicking, making mistakes. The leader examined the torn cloth, raised his hand in a signal that meant close pursuit, and gestured his team forward into the clearing. They approached the nest tree in standard formation, 2-point warriors ahead, the leader and a specialist in the middle, 2 rear guards watching their backs. Professional, coordinated, exactly what you'd expect from elite forces. The point warriors entered the clearing first, their eyes scanning for threats at ground level, checking for ambush positions, reading the trail. The leader stepped into the open, his attention focused on the obvious signs of passage. He raised his hand, about to signal his team to advance, to pursue what they believed was a fleeing target. Marlin's arrow took the wasp nest through its attachment point, the stone arrowhead cutting through the organic anchor like a scalpel. The massive structure dropped 3 meters and exploded on impact with the ground. The desert wasps erupted in a fury that turned the clearing into a killing zone. Thousands of insects boiled out from the shattered nest, their chemical communication pheromones screaming threat and attack. The warriors had no time to react, no chance to form a defensive response. The swarm engulfed them in seconds, insects crawling into every gap in their armor, finding exposed skin at joints and neck seals, stinging with venom that burned like liquid fire. The professional discipline of the elite guard shattered under the assault. The point warriors went down first, their bodies convulsing as venom overloaded their nervous systems. The leader tried to organize a retreat, tried to get his people to move in coordinated fashion, but wasps were in his eyes and his mouth, his commands turning into screams. The specialist managed to ignite some kind of smoke device, but the wasps didn't care about smoke. They only cared about defending their nest against threats. 3 warriors were down and dying, their bodies jerking as paralysis set in, unable to even scream anymore. The other 3 tried to run, slapping frantically at the insects covering their faces, their movements panicked and uncoordinated. This was when Marlene emerged from his perch, moving through the branches with careful speed, staying away from the worst of the swarm. He shot the first fleeing warrior through the gap between helmet and shoulder armor, his arrow finding the major vessels in the neck. The warrior went down hard, dead before hitting the ground. The second warrior made it 20 meters before Marlene's next arrow took him through the armpit joint into the chest cavity. That one managed a few more steps before collapsing. The third warrior was running hard, had almost made it clear of the immediate swarm when Marlene's arrow caught him in the small of the back, severing the spine. He dropped like a puppet with cut strings. Marlene waited in his position for another 10 minutes, letting the wasp swarm settle and disperse back to their nest. The insects were agitated but not suicidal, and once the immediate threats were neutralized, they began the process of repairing their damaged home. Only when the clearing was clear did he descend, moving carefully to avoid attracting renewed attention from any lingering wasps. He approached the bodies systematically, checking each warrior to confirm death. 3 were clearly gone, their faces swollen from multiple stings, their bodies showing the classic signs of the wasp's paralytic venom. The other 3 he'd shot himself. He collected his arrows from the bodies, wiping them clean, checking the stone heads for damage. 1 arrowhead had chipped on bone, rendering it unreliable. He discarded it and kept the shaft, which could be retipped later. From the bodies he took water, dried rations, and some useful cord. Everything else he left, including their weapons and armor. Too heavy, too noisy, too likely to slow him down. Weight kills faster than enemies. Rubena emerged from her hiding spot as he finished his work, her face pale but composed as she looked at the carnage. 6 elite warriors dead, and the human hadn't even drawn his blade. She'd never seen combat before, not really, just the aftermath of her family's murder. This was different, seeing the planning and execution, understanding how someone could turn the environment itself into a weapon. "You didn't fight them," she observed, her voice carefully neutral. "Fighting is for when you have no other choice," Marlene replied, shouldering his pack with its small additions. "Smart beats strong, force beats skill, environment beats force. Remember that. Your uncle commands fighters. Fighters think in terms of confrontation and victory, but survival isn't about winning fights. It's about avoiding them or making them so one-sided that calling it a fight is generous." "My father commanded armies," Rubena said quietly. "He taught his generals that honor in combat was the highest virtue." "How'd that work out for him?" Marlene asked bluntly, then caught himself. The girl didn't need cruelty added to her burdens. "Sorry, that was harsh. Your father was probably a good man leading in a time of peace, but your uncle understood something your father didn't. Honor and virtue are luxuries you can only afford when you're safe. When you're not safe, when you're fighting for your life, the only virtue that matters is effectiveness. Do what works, stay alive, win by any means necessary. Then if you survive, you can work on rebuilding honor and virtue." They moved on, leaving the elite guard to feed the jungle. The death of 6 warriors would send a message to Korvax, one that said his enemy was capable, prepared, and didn't fight fairly. Good. Let him worry. Let him imagine threats worse than reality. Fear was a weapon too. As they traveled, Marlene noticed Rubena watching him differently, studying his movements, his choices, his reactions. She was learning, absorbing lessons, building her own understanding of what survival required. He didn't know if that was good or bad. The skills he had were useful for staying alive in hostile environments, but they came with costs. He'd spent 7 years becoming an effective killer, stripping away most of what made him human, and he wasn't sure if that trade was worth it. But it was too late for him to go back, so the best he could do was make sure the girl learned the skills without losing herself completely. The jungle gave way to rocky highlands as they traveled south over the next 2 days, the terrain transitioning from dense growth to open stone. The change was gradual at first, then suddenly stark, like walking from one season directly into another. The air became drier, the temperature swings more extreme, the ground harder beneath their feet. The sounds changed too, the constant noise of the jungle replaced by the occasional cry of highland birds and the whisper of wind across stone. The highlands were cut by a violent river, a torrent of meltwater from distant ice peaks that moved with enough force to carry boulders downstream. The water was clouded with suspended sediment, turning it a pale blue-white color that looked almost luminous in the sunlight. The riverbed was a maze of sharp stones that could slice through boot leather as easily as any blade, and the current was strong enough to sweep away anything that lost its footing. There was a bridge visible in the distance, perhaps 3 kilometers upstream, a crude but functional structure that spanned the narrowest point of the gorge. That bridge would have guards, probably reinforced after the loss of the patrol in the jungle. Trying to cross there would mean fighting through whatever forces Korvax had stationed, and fighting meant casualties, and casualties meant mission failure. Marlene studied the river for a long time, watching how it moved, reading the patterns of current and depth. The crossing here would be brutal, but possible. More importantly, it would be unexpected. Nobody in their right mind would try to ford this river when a bridge existed upstream. "We cross here," he said finally. Rubena looked at the violent water, at the sharp rocks, at the way the current created eddies and whirlpools that could trap and drown. "It's too strong," she said, not arguing exactly, just stating an observation. "Yes, that's why they won't expect it. That's why the far bank won't have guards watching this section." Marlene began stripping off his boots, his movements methodical. "Every crossing has costs. The bridge costs combat and delays. This costs pain and risk. I prefer pain and risk. Pain ends. Combat might not." He cut a length of vine from a nearby plant, tested its strength thoroughly, and fashioned it into a crude harness. He secured Rubena to his back, making sure the bindings were tight enough to hold, but not so tight they'd cut off circulation. Her small arms wrapped around his neck, her blue face pressed against his shoulder. "Hold on," he said, his voice harder than usual. "Don't let go no matter what happens. If you fall, the river will kill you faster than I can save you. Understand?" "I won't fall," she promised, her grip tightening. Marlene stepped into the river and the cold hit him like a physical blow, driving the breath from his lungs and shocking his system into emergency response. The water temperature was barely above freezing, kept liquid by its movement and minerals, and it leached heat from his body with terrifying efficiency. His muscles seized for a moment before training took over and forced them to relax. Tension made you rigid, rigidity made you fall. Stay loose, stay flexible, adapt to conditions. The current immediately tried to sweep his legs out from under him, a constant pressure that felt like hands pushing at his calves and thighs. He braced his feet against the rocks, feeling sharp edges bite through his wet socks into the soles of his feet. Each step was a calculated risk, a careful search for stable footing among treacherous stones. The water clouded with sediment made it impossible to see the bottom, so he had to feel his way, testing each rock before committing his weight. 10 meters from shore, and his legs were already aching from the constant effort of staying upright. 20 meters, and the cold was seeping into his core, making his movement sluggish. 30 meters, and he was in the deepest part of the channel, water reaching his chest, Rubena barely above the waterline. The current here was strongest, a crushing force that wanted nothing more than to sweep them downstream into the rapids visible 100 meters away, where rocks broke the surface like teeth. Marlin's foot slipped on algae-covered stone. For a sickening moment, he felt himself tilting, gravity and current combining to pull him down. If he went under with Rubena on his back, they'd both drown. His left foot scrabbled for purchase, finding nothing but smooth stone. The current pushed harder, sensing weakness. Marlene threw his weight sideways, a desperate move that drove his ribs into a boulder with enough force to crack bone. The impact knocked the air from his lungs in an explosive gasp, but his body caught on the rock, stopped his fall. He hung there for a few seconds, breathing in short, painful gasps before forcing his body back upright. Rubena had made no sound during any of this, her small body pressed tight against his back, her trust absolute despite the terror she must be feeling. That trust steadied him more than any rational thought could. He continued forward, each step now accompanied by stabbing pain in his ribs where bone had met stone. 50 meters. The water grew shallower, the current slightly weaker. 60 meters. His feet found gravel rather than sharp rock, giving better purchase. 70 meters. The shore was close now, just another 10 meters of grinding effort. He forced his legs to keep moving even though they felt like lead, forced his feet to find solid footing even though he could barely feel them through the cold numbness, forced his body to stay upright through sheer stubborn will. His feet found the bank. He climbed out of the river, water streaming from his clothes, his entire body shaking from cold and exhaustion. His legs threatened to give out, but he remained standing, immediately scanning the area for threats. Only when he was certain they were alone did he allow himself to kneel and untie Rubena. She slid off his back, her lips blue from cold exposure, but her eyes bright with something that might have been pride in surviving. She looked at his feet and her expression changed. "You're bleeding everywhere," she said, pointing. Marlin looked down at his feet. The rocks had opened multiple cuts across his soles, deep enough that blood flowed freely, mixing with river water in pink streams. His toes were cut as well, and there was a particularly nasty gash across his left arch that would make walking painful. He shrugged. "It'll stop eventually. Bodies are good at that." He wrung out his clothes as much as possible, a futile gesture since they were soaked through, but getting rid of excess water would help his body warm faster. Then he pulled his boots back on over his shredded feet. The leather immediately started chafing against the open wounds, a sharp burning sensation that would accompany every step. He'd endured worse. Pain was just information, and this information was telling him nothing he didn't already know. They moved away from the river, putting distance between themselves and the crossing point before stopping to rest. Marlene's ribs throbbed with each breath, probably cracked but not broken completely. He'd survive. In the relative shelter of a rock overhang, he built a tiny fire and they dried their clothes as much as possible. Rubena dozed while he kept watch, her exhaustion finally overcoming her fear. By evening they were moving again, Marlene's limp barely noticeable despite the pain. His body had learned to compartmentalize discomfort, to function through damage that would incapacitate most people. It was a useful skill, but one that came at a cost. He knew he was accumulating injuries faster than he was healing, knew that eventually something would fail at a critical moment, but that was a problem for future Marlene to deal with. Present Marlene just needed to keep moving. The terrain continued to change as they traveled, becoming more mountainous, the paths steeper and more treacherous. They were entering Korvax's territory now, the region he controlled through force and intimidation. Evidence of his rule was everywhere. Burned settlements where resistance had been crushed, gibbets holding the remains of those who'd opposed him, work camps where slaves mined precious metals under brutal conditions. The land itself seemed to recoil from the tyrant's touch. On their fourth night after leaving the river, they reached a forest of spore fungi, and Marlene cursed under his breath when he recognized what they were facing. This was genuinely bad luck. The fungi released hallucinogenic spores during their reproductive cycle, and it was clearly that season. He could see the faint shimmer in the air, billions of microscopic particles drifting on the breeze like pollen made visible. "Cover your mouth and nose," he told Rubena, tearing strips from his already abused shirt. He tied one around her face, another around his own, creating makeshift filters that would reduce but not eliminate their exposure to the spores. They entered the forest cautiously, trying to breathe shallowly, but within minutes Marlene felt the effects beginning. Colors became too bright, edges too sharp, sounds too loud. His perception was shifting, reality becoming negotiable. He focused on his breathing, on the feeling of his feet touching ground, on any physical sensation that could anchor him to the material world. Rubina stumbled and Marlene caught her automatically. Her eyes were unfocused, tears streaming down her face. "Papa," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Papa, please don't leave me. Papa, wake up." Marlene understood what was happening. The spores were triggering trauma responses, dragging suppressed memories back to the surface and making them immediate, making them now. In her mind, she wasn't in this forest. She was back in the palace, watching her father die. Then his own visions began. He saw Earth, specifically his house in the suburbs where he lived before everything went wrong. His wife Maria stood in the doorway, the afternoon sun behind her making her red hair glow like fire. Their daughter Elena was beside her, maybe 8 years old, gap-toothed and smiling. They were waving to him, calling his name, beckoning him home. But even as he watched, the scene began to change. The sky darkened. The house started burning, flames erupting from windows. Maria was screaming his name, no longer welcoming but desperate, terrified. Elena was reaching for him, her small hands extended, crying for her daddy as fire consumed her. It wasn't real. Marlene knew with his rational mind that this wasn't real, that Maria and Elena had died years ago in an accident, that the fire was his guilt and grief made manifest by alien spores. But the spores didn't care about rational minds. They bypassed logic and struck directly at the limbic system, at the primitive brain that couldn't distinguish memory from present horror. His hand moved automatically, muscle memory overriding hallucination. He drew his knife and pressed the blade against his forearm, cutting through skin in a deliberate, controlled motion. Not deep, not serious, just enough to break skin and produce sharp, immediate pain. The sensation cut through the hallucination like ice water, shocking his nervous system back into processing real stimuli rather than imagined ones. The world snapped back into focus, the fire and screaming fading into the background of his mind where they lived permanently. Rubena was curling into a ball, lost in her nightmare. Marlene grabbed her hand and squeezed hard, hard enough to hurt, hard enough to override whatever she was seeing. "Look at me," he commanded, his voice cutting through her terror. She didn't respond. He squeezed harder, his grip probably leaving bruises. "Look at me right now." Her eyes found his, wild and unfocused and seeing things that weren't there. "Your father is dead," Marlene said harshly, no gentleness in his tone. "That's true, that happened. You watched him die and you couldn't stop it. But you're alive right now. I'm alive right now. This forest is trying to kill us with lies. Lies are weapons and we don't let weapons work. Do you understand me?" She blinked, struggling to process words through the chemical fog distorting her perception. I can see him, she whispered. He's right there. He's bleeding. He's not there. I'm here. Feel my hand. Feel my grip. That's real. The rest is poison-making pictures in your brain. Marlin pulled her to her feet, keeping his grip painful enough to be grounding. We walk. We don't stop. You focus on my back. You don't look at anything else. You follow my steps exactly. Nothing exists except my back and your feet. Understand? I understand, she managed, her voice small. They moved through the spore forest step by agonizing step. The visions came in waves, triggered by fluctuations in spore concentration. Marlene would see his dead family, sometimes in the fire, sometimes in other scenarios his guilt conjured. Each time he'd drive his thumbnail into the cut on his arm, using pain to anchor himself to reality. Rubina stumbled repeatedly, lost in visions of her murdered family, but each time he pulled her forward, his grip the only real thing in her dissolving world. The forest seemed endless, distance becoming meaningless when your mind couldn't reliably process space. Marlene navigated by dead reckoning and sun position, trusting years of wilderness experience to keep them on course, even when his perception was compromised. At some point, his arm wound from the river crossing reopened, blood mixing with the fresh cuts he'd made, but he barely noticed. Pain was currency, and he was spending it to buy survival. When they finally emerged on the far side, both collapsed immediately. Marlin's arm was bleeding freely from where he'd reopened the wound a dozen times. Rubina was shaking, her breath coming in sobs, her small body pushed beyond its limits. They lay there for perhaps 20 minutes before either of them could move. Why did you hurt yourself? She asked when she could finally speak, looking at his bloodied arm. Marlene was using water from his canteen to clean the wound, his movements mechanical. Pain is honest, he said. Fear lies, grief lies, memory lies. But pain just is. When everything else becomes untrustworthy, when your own mind turns against you, pain will tell you what's real. It's an anchor. Not a pleasant one, but anchors don't need to be pleasant. They need to hold. She absorbed this silently, adding it to her growing collection of harsh survival lessons. That night, as Marlin stitched his various wounds closed with thorns and plant fiber, working by firelight with the steady hands of someone who'd performed this operation many times, Rubina asked a question that had clearly been building in her mind. Why are you helping me? Her voice was quiet but direct. I'm not your people. I'm not your species. You could have taken the payment and left, or just ignored me completely. Why risk your life for someone who means nothing to you? Marlin paused in his stitching, considering how to answer. The truth was complicated, tangled up with guilt and loss, and the desperate need to find meaning in a universe that had taken everything from him. But she deserved more than silence. The world doesn't divide into humans and aliens, he said finally, tying off a stitch and starting another. It divides into hunters and prey. Your uncle thinks he's a hunter, the apex predator of this region, but he's just a big animal wearing a crown. Big animals get confident. They forget that being large isn't the same as being deadly. They forget that smaller creatures can be smart, can be patient, can find the one weak point that size can't protect. I know how big animals die. I've killed hundreds of them. Is that the only reason? Marlin was quiet for a moment, his hands steady as he worked. No, he admitted. That's the reason I tell myself. But there's another one. Your uncle's warriors tried to kill me by sending elite guards. That made it personal. Men like him need to learn that power has limits, that there's always someone or something that can kill them. And you looked at me without fear, with respect instead of horror, and that's rare enough that it deserves acknowledgement. He didn't mention the real reason, the one that lived deep in his damaged psyche, that when he looked at her, he saw his daughter, that saving this child was his chance to save the one he'd failed, that maybe if he got her to safety, some cosmic scale would balance, and his guilt would ease even a fraction. Some truths were too raw to speak aloud, even to himself. Will he be hard to kill? Rubina asked. Everyone's easy to kill if you know their weaknesses, Marlene replied. The hard part is getting close enough to exploit those weaknesses without dying first. Your uncle surrounds himself with guards, lives in a fortress, has resources in numbers. But none of that matters if I can reach him, and I will reach him, because I'm patient and he's not. Because I'm willing to do things he'd never imagine. Because I don't care about glory or honor or making a statement. I just care about making him stop breathing. What if you die trying? Then you run, you hide, you survive, you grow up, and when you're strong enough, you come back and finish what I started. He looked at her directly. But I don't plan on dying. I've survived 7 years on this planet by being harder to kill than everything else. Your uncle is just one more obstacle. They slept in shifts that night, each keeping watch while the other rested. Marlene's sleep was as troubled as ever, filled with fire and screaming, with faces of people he'd failed. But he'd learned to function through nightmares, to rise from broken sleep and still be effective. It was another skill that came with costs, another piece of his humanity traded for survival capability. The mountains rose ahead of them, jagged peaks that clawed at the sky like broken teeth. This was Korvax's heartland, where he'd built his power base and crushed all resistance. The patrol frequency increased dramatically as they climbed into the highlands. 3 times in 2 days, Marlene spotted searching parties and hid them until the danger passed. The warriors were no longer just patrolling randomly. They were converging, tightening a net around specific areas. Someone competent was directing the search, using logic and probability to narrow the possibilities. They know we're coming, Marlene observed as they watched another patrol pass from concealment. Someone's put together that you're not dead, that you have help, and that the logical target is the Citadel. They're trying to close the approaches. Can we get through? Yes, because they're assuming we'll take one of the standard paths. We won't. He studied the terrain with calculating eyes. There's always a way through any defense. You just have to be willing to pay the price to find it. The price revealed itself on their 4th day in the mountains. They'd been working their way along a narrow mountain path with cliffs on both sides, the trail barely wide enough for single file. It was a natural choke point, easy to defend but difficult to avoid. Marlene had hoped to pass through without being noticed, but luck ran out. He heard the whistle first, a coordination signal echoing across the rocks, then answering whistles from 3 other directions. They'd been triangulated by a well-trained unit using proper search protocols. He grabbed Rubena's hand and ran. The warriors came from above and below, moving with coordinated precision that spoke of extensive training and combat experience. These weren't standard guards, this was another elite unit. 8 warriors, each one a veteran with the scars to prove it. Their armor was quality work, their weapons sharp and well-maintained, their movements efficient. This was going to be difficult. Marlene's mind worked at combat speed, analyzing terrain and options with the cold calculation of someone who'd survived by making good decisions under pressure. They were on a narrow path with cliffs on both sides. Above, an unstable rock face showed signs of weathering and seismic stress, natural fault lines visible to trained eyes. Below, a sharp drop into a ravine whose bottom was lost in shadow. He pushed Rubena toward a narrow crevice in the cliff wall, a crack barely wide enough for her small body. Get in there. Get as deep as you can. Don't come out until I call you, even if you hear me screaming. Especially if you hear me screaming. Promise me. But, she started, promise me now or I die here, and you die alone later. I promise, she said, her voice shaking. Good. Now hide. She squeezed into the crevice and disappeared into shadow. Marlene turned to face the approaching warriors, his bow already in hand. The first warriors appeared on the path ahead, weapons drawn, their formation tight. Marlene didn't aim for them. He aimed upward, finding a specific point in the rock face where stress fractures met in a keystone configuration. His arrow flew true, striking the critical point with perfect accuracy. Stone cracked with a sound like thunder. The warriors looked up just as the rock face gave way. The avalanche wasn't massive, nothing like the catastrophic slides that could level mountains. But it didn't need to be massive. Boulders and debris cascaded down onto the narrow path, turning the carefully controlled approach into chaos. 2 warriors were caught directly, crushed before they could react. The others dove for cover, their formation breaking as survival instinct overrode training. Marlene used the chaos. His next arrow took the nearest warrior through the throat, dropping him instantly. He sprinted forward, drawing his long knife, closing the distance while they were still disorganized. A warrior rose to block him, sword already swinging in a defensive pattern. Marlin didn't slow. He dropped into a slide, his momentum carrying him under the sword swing, came up inside the warrior's guard, and drove his knife upward through the soft tissue beneath the jaw. The blade punched through the warrior's palate into his brain. Marlin ripped the knife out and kept moving. Another warrior came from the right. Marlin twisted, felt the spear graze his ribs, opening skin but missing anything vital. He broke the warrior's knee with a savage kick that hyperextended the joint backward. As the warrior fell screaming, Marlane's knife found his eye socket, driving deep into the brain. The warrior dropped. 4 dead, 4 remaining. But those 4 had reorganized despite the chaos, moving into defensive formation, covering each other's angles. These were true professionals, experienced enough to adapt quickly. Marlane was breathing hard now, the altitude and exertion combining with his accumulated injuries to slow his movements. He couldn't take 4 trained warriors in direct combat while protecting Rubena's position. He needed another edge. He shot his next arrow at the cliff edge near the remaining warriors, hitting another weak point he'd identified earlier. More rock fell, not enough to kill, but enough to force them back toward the ravine's edge. Then Marlene shot the warrior in the lead through the ankle, the arrow punching through armor at the joint and shattering bone. The man screamed and fell, tumbling backward into his companions. His weight and momentum carried one warrior over the edge. The man's scream cut off abruptly as he hit bottom somewhere far below. 3 left. A warrior charged, sword raised for an overhead strike. Marlene sidestepped and grabbed the warrior's sword arm, using the attacker's own momentum to redirect him toward the cliff edge. The warrior tried to recover his balance, but Marlene helped him along with a hard shove. He went over, his cry fading into distance. 2 left, and they were done attacking. They backed away slowly, their eyes showing something new. Not fear exactly, but recognition. Recognition that the human in front of them was more dangerous than they'd been told, more capable than they'd imagined, that the stories might not be exaggerated, but they were still professionals. They wouldn't run without at least attempting completion. They spread out, trying to flank him, using classic pincer tactics. Then one of them made a mistake. He glanced toward the crevice where Rubena was hidden, his eyes giving away that he'd spotted her hiding place. That glance was all Marlene needed. He moved before the warrior could exploit his discovery, closing distance with explosive speed despite his injuries. His knife struck like a snake, finding the gap in armor at the shoulder. The blade slid between plates and into the subclavian artery. Blood sprayed. The warrior had perhaps 30 seconds before blood loss rendered him unconscious. He tried to strike back, but his sword arm wasn't responding properly, nerves severed along with the artery. Marlene withdrew his knife and the warrior went to his knees, his remaining hand trying futilely to stop the bleeding. The last warrior stood alone, facing Marlene across 10 meters of broken ground. This one was older, more experienced, with scars that told stories of a long career. His sword was ready, his stance professional, but his eyes showed calculation rather than eagerness. He was evaluating his chances and finding them poor. "You could walk away," Marlene said, his voice rough from exertion. "Tell your commander you lost my trail. Live to fight another day." The warrior considered this for a long moment. Then he shook his head. "Korvax kills deserters slowly. I'd rather die quickly here than slowly there." "Your choice," Marlene acknowledged. The warrior attacked with skill and precision, his sword work excellent, his footwork solid. He was good, maybe the best Marlene had faced on this planet. But Marlene had 7 years of experience fighting things that were faster, stronger, and more lethal than any warrior. He'd learned to read attacks before they developed, to move efficiently rather than quickly, to exploit the tiny openings that appeared and vanished in fractions of seconds. The swords came in series, high and low, forcing Marlene to give ground. His knife couldn't block that heavy blade effectively, so he focused on not being where the blade was. He circled, watching the warrior's eyes, reading his intentions. The warrior favored his right side slightly. His left knee had an old injury that affected his pivot. His breathing was labored from the altitude. Marlene made the warrior work, made him chase, made him expend energy on attacks that found only air. After 5 minutes of this, the warrior's movements were slower, more predictable. After 10 minutes, he was gasping. After 15 minutes, he made the mistake Marlin had been waiting for. The warrior committed to an overhead strike, putting his full weight into it, seeking to end the fight with one powerful blow. Marlin sidestepped, and the heavy blade struck rock where he'd been standing. In the fraction of a second while the warrior recovered from the strike, Marlin moved inside his reach and drove his knife up between the ribs, angling toward the heart. The blade found its mark. The warrior's eyes went wide, his body recognizing death before his mind caught up. He fell forward and Marlin stepped aside, letting gravity finish what he'd started. Marlin stood breathing hard, surveying the carnage. 8 elite warriors dead, and he was still standing. But barely. His ribs screamed with each breath, possibly cracked in multiple places now. The wound on his side had reopened, blood soaking his shirt. His feet were still damaged from the river crossing. New cuts and bruises covered his body. He was accumulating damage faster than he could heal, operating on reserves that were nearly depleted. "Rubena," he called, his voice steady despite the pain. "Come out." She emerged from the crevice, her eyes wide as she took in the scene. 8 bodies, blood on the rocks, and a human who looked like he should have died several injuries ago, but somehow was still functioning. "We need to move," Marlene said. "More will come. They always send more." They found shelter in a cave system several hours later. Marlene was leaving a blood trail now, his body unable to stop the bleeding from multiple wounds. In the cave, by the light of a small fire, he performed triage. The worst wound was the spear graze across his ribs. It had opened deep, cutting through muscle. Marlene cleaned it with water, checked for debris, then prepared for what came next. "Turn away if you want," he told Rubena. "No," she said firmly. "If I'm to rule someday, I must see reality. All of it." Marlene nodded and heated his long knife in the fire until it glowed red. Then he pressed the flat of the blade against his wound. The smell of his own burning flesh filled the cave, a sickening, sweet odor that would have made him vomit if his body had anything left to give. He made no sound during the cauterization, but his hands shook from the effort of staying still, and his teeth were clenched so hard his jaw ached. When the wound was sealed, he set the knife aside and picked up his short knife and the sinew he'd taken from kills days ago. Thread and needle, improvised but effective. He stitched the worst of his other cuts closed, his movements becoming mechanical as exhaustion and pain made his hands clumsy. Rubena handed him water without being asked, her face pale but composed. She hadn't looked away during any of it, forcing herself to witness what survival required. "The body is just clay," Marlene said when he finished, his voice tight. "The important thing is to fire it properly so the cracks don't spread. Otherwise it becomes useless pottery that shatters at the first real stress." "You're not clay," Rubena said quietly, her eyes meeting his. "Clay breaks. You don't." "Everything breaks eventually," Marlene replied. "The trick is breaking in ways you can repair. Most people break in their minds first, and that's harder to fix than body damage. Bodies want to heal. Minds want to forget. But forgetting doesn't fix anything. It just buries problems deeper." They stayed in the cave for 2 days while Marlene's body performed its emergency repairs. The fever came as expected, his immune system fighting alien bacteria from weapons that hadn't been properly cleaned. He endured it with gritted teeth, his body shaking with chills one moment and burning the next. Rubena kept watch, kept the fire going, rationed their remaining food and water. She was learning fast, adapting to necessity. When the fever broke on the second day, Marlene felt weak but functional. His wounds were angry red, but showed no signs of serious infection. His ribs hurt, but he could breathe without feeling like knives were stabbing his lungs. His feet had scabbed over and would support his weight. He was battered, bloodied, and running on fumes, but he was alive and mobile. That would have to be enough. On the 3rd day, they continued toward the citadel, moving slowly, conserving energy. The terrain continued to rise, entering the high mountains where air was thin and temperatures dropped sharply at night. Evidence of Korvac's rule became more prevalent. Work camps where slaves extracted precious metals from the mountain heart. Guard posts on strategic high points. Patrol routes that covered most approaches. But not all approaches. Never all approaches. Perfect security didn't exist. And even imperfect security had weaknesses if you were patient enough to find them. They passed through a mining settlement at dusk, moving like ghosts through the shadows. The settlement was a grim place, all function without comfort, housing for workers who were technically free but practically slaves. They worked until they died, their debts to Korvax always mysteriously growing faster than they could pay them. Marlene's supplies were nearly exhausted. They'd been traveling for 10 days and his pack was almost empty. In the settlement, he saw children, their ribs visible through thin skin, their eyes holding the dull acceptance of permanent hunger. He looked at his last rations, maybe 2 days of food if he was careful, then at the children. He gave them everything. Rubena watched this but said nothing until they were clear of the settlement and hidden in the rocks beyond. "Now we have nothing to eat," she observed, her tone neutral rather than accusatory. "We'll find something," Marlene replied. "Hunt a small creature, forage some plants that are safe. I've survived on less. But those children can't hunt and don't have options. We do. My uncle would say you're weak for giving away resources. Your uncle's definition of strength is based on accumulation and control. Mine's based on what you can do when you have nothing. I can survive without those rations. Those children couldn't. That's not weakness. That's choosing where to apply force for maximum effect." Word spread through the settlements that night, whispered in the darkness where Korvax's guards couldn't hear. "The pale spirit," they said, "a human who walked untouched through the tyrant's lands, who killed elite warriors without breaking stride, who showed mercy to children." The story grew with each telling, becoming mythic, and with each retelling, Korvax's guards grew more nervous. In the citadel, the warlord heard these reports and his amusement had finally died. This human was becoming a problem. He was supposed to have been killed by the first elite squad, or the second, or the third. Instead, all 3 squads were dead and the human kept coming. Korvax did what tyrants always did when threatened. He consolidated his power, pulled his forces back to the citadel, and prepared for siege. The citadel was indeed formidable, carved from the mountain itself over generations. Walls 3 meters thick, made from stone that had withstood earthquakes and wars. Guards at every entrance, archers on every tower. Supply stores sufficient for months. It was designed to be impregnable, and against any conventional assault, it probably was. But Marlene wasn't planning a conventional assault. For 3 nights, he moved around the citadel like a ghost, studying its defenses, observing patrol patterns, looking for weaknesses. On the first night, he left an arrow embedded in the main gate, fletched with blue feathers from a thunderer, its message clear. "I can reach you." On the second night, he left the pelt of a shadow cat, the deadliest predator in these mountains, arranged like a cloak over the main guard post. The guards found it at dawn, and their hands shook as they took it down. On the third night, he left nothing but footprints in blood that led from the wall to nowhere, suggesting things that couldn't be. The psychological effect was exactly what he'd intended. The guards began to desert, not many but enough. Warriors who had served Korvax for years, who had never questioned his power, now looked at the darkness beyond the walls and wondered. What kind of creature could hunt and kill so silently? What kind of mind could turn their fortress into a cage? What would happen when this thing finally decided to stop playing and started killing seriously? Korvax executed the deserters publicly, had their bodies displayed on the walls as warning. But that night, 3 more guards vanished into the darkness. And the next night, 5 more. The fortress was bleeding personnel, and fear was more contagious than any disease. The tyrant retreated to his inner chambers, surrounded by his most loyal guards, the ones whose fates were too tied to his own to contemplate betrayal. Let the human come. Let him try to breach walls that had stood for a century. Korvax had numbers, weapons, fortifications, resources. The human had nothing but reputation, and reputation couldn't block swords or turn aside arrows. Marlene stood on a ridge overlooking the citadel, Rubena beside him, studying the fortress in the light of the sun. It was indeed impressive, a masterwork of defensive architecture. The main approaches were well guarded and probably trapped. The walls were too high and smooth for climbing. The gates were reinforced metal that could withstand battering rams. From a conventional standpoint, Taking this fortress would require an army and months of siege. But Marlin wasn't looking at the fortifications. He was looking at the terrain. "See the vertical cliff behind the fortress?" he said quietly, pointing. "That's our way in." Rubina followed his gesture, and her expression showed doubt for the first time in days. "That's impossible. No one can climb that." "Good. That means no one will be watching it. Impossible things don't require guards." He studied the cliff face with experienced eyes, noting the tiny ledges and cracks that would serve as handholds, identifying the route that would work. "It's not impossible. It's just very difficult and very dangerous. But so is trying to fight through the front gates. I prefer difficult and dangerous to certain death." They spent the day resting in a hidden cave, conserving energy for what was coming. Marlene checked his equipment one final time. 4 arrows left, his 2 knives, a length of rope. That was all. He had no armor, no backup weapons, no tools for getting through locked doors, just his skills, his experience, and his absolute refusal to fail. As night fell, they made their approach through the burned desert that surrounded the citadel. This was Korvax's strategy of denial, burning everything within a kilometer of his fortress so attackers would have no cover. Smart if you were fighting conventional forces, but fire couldn't burn stone, and stone offered concealment if you knew how to use it. They covered themselves in mud and blue clay taken from a stream bed, becoming the same color as the surrounding stone. Then they began their crawl. 100 meters of open ground separated them from the base of the cliff. Marlene moved during wind gusts, when the sound and movement would mask his own, when the guards on the walls would be squinting against blown dust. Crawl 10 meters, freeze, become stone. Wait for the next gust. Crawl again. Rubina followed his example, her smaller body learning the rhythm. The process was excruciating. The baked earth was still hot from the day's sun, hot enough to raise blisters on exposed skin. Rocks cut into their hands and knees. The clay dried and cracked, requiring constant reapplication. Thirst became a constant companion, their canteens long empty, but there was no water here, and wouldn't be until they reached the citadel. It took 5 hours to cross 100 meters. When they finally reached the base of the cliff, Marlene's hands were bleeding, his already damaged ribs had reopened their wounds, and every muscle in his body screamed for rest. Rubina was in similar condition, her young body pushed beyond what should have been possible, but she hadn't made a single sound of complaint. Marlene looked up at the cliff. 100 meters of vertical rock, no climbing equipment, no safety gear, no backup plan, just bare hands and will. He'd free climbed before, had scaled cliffs for fun back when he was younger and stupider, but never while injured, never while exhausted, never while responsible for another life. This climb should be impossible. He began anyway. The first 30 meters weren't terrible. The rock here had decent handholds, cracks and ledges weathered into the stone over centuries. His fingers found purchase, his feet braced against tiny protrusions, his body weight distributed across multiple contact points. The movements were slow and methodical, each grip tested before committing his weight, each step verified before moving his hands. Climbing wasn't about strength, though strength helped. It was about technique, about understanding how to move your center of gravity, about reading rock and finding the path that worked. At 50 meters, his fingers started failing. The rough stone had abraded away skin, leaving raw flesh that left blood smears on the rock. Each grip was agony, his fingers screaming protest, but he forced them to maintain pressure. At this height, losing grip meant death, so pain became irrelevant. His brain simply stopped processing the signals, treating them as a background noise. At 70 meters, he reached a section of smooth rock with no visible handholds. This was the crux, the point where most climbers would have to turn back. But there was no turning back, no retreat, only upward or death. Marlene examined the rock by feel in the dim moonlight. There, a crack barely wide enough for fingertips, running diagonally for 3 meters. He'd have to traverse it sideways, trusting his grip, with his feet finding purchase on stone smoother than glass. He committed to the traverse, his fingers jammed into the crack, using friction and compression to create grip where none should exist. His feet pressed against smooth stone, trusting to rubber soles and desperation. For 3 meters, he moved sideways across rock that wanted nothing more than to reject him. Twice his fingers slipped, and only scrambling desperation saved him from falling. When he reached the next stable position, he allowed himself 10 seconds of rest. At 90 meters, he was climbing on autopilot, his conscious mind having retreated to some safe space while his body continued to function through instinct and training. His muscles were done, running on reserves that didn't exist, but they kept contracting and releasing because stopping meant dying. His fingers were shredded, leaving blood trails down the rock face, but they kept gripping because letting go meant death. He reached the top and pulled himself over the edge through sheer stubborn will. For a long moment he simply lay there, every muscle trembling, his breathing ragged, his body having given everything it had and then more. But he couldn't afford rest. Not yet. He secured his rope to a solid outcrop, tested it thoroughly, and lowered it down the cliff face. Then he began pulling, his torn hands protesting, hauling Rubina up meter by painful meter. She helped as much as she could, using the rope to climb, while he provided the majority of the force. But even with her assistance, it took an hour to bring her to the top. When she finally reached the edge, they both collapsed, too exhausted for words. But they were inside the fortress perimeter now, behind the defenses, where no one expected threats to appear. After a few minutes of rest, Marlene forced himself to move. The citadel's interior was a maze of corridors and chambers, but he'd studied the structure from outside and had a rough mental map. He moved through shadows, Rubina following, both of them becoming ghosts in the halls of their enemy. Twice he was forced to kill. Both times were silent, quick, professional. A hand over the mouth to prevent outcry, a knife finding the gap between vertebrae, or sliding up under the ribs to pierce the heart. The guards died without knowing what killed them, and Marlene hid their bodies in darkened rooms where they wouldn't be found until morning. They moved deeper into the fortress, following the increasing opulence of decoration. Tyrants always kept the best quarters for themselves, displayed their wealth ostentatiously. It made them easier to find. The throne room doors were massive, carved from black wood and inlaid with precious metals, a monument to ego and power. 4 guards stood watch, alert and professional, elite warriors who wouldn't be tricked or avoided. Marlene considered his options. He had 4 arrows left, 4 guards, perfect economy if nothing went wrong. But things always went wrong, which meant he'd be fighting in melee while protecting Rubina. His body was already close to failure. One more serious fight might be his last. He knocked an arrow anyway. The first guard died with an arrow in his eye socket before the alarm could be raised. The second died a heartbeat later, Marlene's arrow through his throat, cutting off any sound. The third guard was raising his spear when the third arrow took him in the chest, punching through armor at the sternum joint, into his heart. The fourth guard managed to sound the alarm bell before Marlene's last arrow killed him. A perfect shot through the narrow gap between helmet and collar, severing the spine. Bells rang throughout the citadel, shattering the night silence. Marlene kicked open the throne room doors and walked in, moving with the confidence of someone who had nothing left to lose. Korvac sat on his throne of carved stone, a massive figure in blue metal armor, easily 2 meters tall with the heavy build of a lifetime warrior. 2 ceremonial swords hung at his sides, beautiful weapons that were nevertheless perfectly functional. Behind him, a squad of guards was already moving into defensive positions, forming a wall of armor and steel between their lord and the threat. "So the human comes at last," Korvac said, his voice deep and amused despite the alarm bells. "You've caused quite the disruption, pale creature, killing my guards, frightening my warriors, spreading sedition among my workers. Do you know how many of my soldiers you've killed to reach this room?" "Not enough," Marlene replied, his voice flat. "Since you're still breathing?" Korvac's laughter boomed. "You're wounded, exhausted, bleeding from a dozen cuts. You have no more arrows than just a knife. My guards will cut you into pieces while I watch." "Your guards are afraid," Marlene observed calmly, his eyes scanning the assembled warriors. "Look at their faces. They're wondering which of them dies first. They've heard the stories. They know what I am." It was true. The guards shifted nervously, their professional discipline cracking at the edges. The pale spirit stood before them, bloodied but unbowed, having achieved the impossible, and their certainty had evaporated. Korvax saw this, and his amusement died. He stood from his throne, drawing his twin swords with a whisper of metal on metal. If you want me, human, you face me, not my guards. Let's see if you are as deadly as the stories claim. Gladly, Marlene said. He looked at Rubena. Stay near the door. Don't interfere, no matter what happens. But, no. His voice was absolute. This is my fight. If I fall, you run. Promise me. I promise, she said, though her voice suggested otherwise. Marlene turned his full attention to Korvax. The tyrant was huge, easily 30 kilograms heavier than Marlene, armored in masterwork metal that covered every vulnerable point. His twin swords were longer and heavier than anything Marlene could carry. His stance spoke of years of training, of battles fought and won. He had every physical advantage. Marlene had one knife and the absolute refusal to accept defeat. Tell me something before we begin, Korvax said, circling slowly, his swords ready. What do you get from this? The girl promised you wealth, position, power in the new regime? I get to see you die, Marlene replied. That's payment enough. You killed children. You made people slaves. You built your power on terror and death. Now you learn that terror cuts both ways, that death comes for everyone eventually, and that sometimes it comes wearing my face. Noble words from a killer, Korvax sneered. You've murdered dozens of my people. How does that make you different from me? I don't pretend it makes me better, Marlene said. I'm just more effective at it. Korvax attacked. The twin swords came at Marlene in a coordinated pattern, high and low, left and right, an assault designed to overwhelm through sheer aggression and power. Each blade could kill with a single solid hit. Together they created a zone of death that should have been impossible to survive. Marlene didn't try to survive it. He became water, flowing around the attacks, never quite where the swords expected him to be. Korvax was fast for his size, his massive frame concealing surprising agility. But size had costs. Each sword swing committed his weight in specific directions. Each attack created tiny windows of vulnerability, and Marlene had spent 7 years learning to spot and exploit tiny windows. The battle became a dance of death, Korvax pursuing with relentless aggression, Marlene evading with calculated efficiency. The throne room rang with the sound of swords striking stone, where Marlene had been moments before. Korvax's guards watched in growing horror as their invincible lord chased a bloodied human around the room without landing a single blow. Marlene was learning Korvax's patterns, cataloging his preferences, identifying his weaknesses. The tyrant favored his right side, his left sword serving more as defense than offense. His left knee had an old injury, probably an arrow wound that had healed improperly, causing him to favor that leg on pivots. His breathing was beginning to labor, the heavy armor and aggressive attacks consuming energy faster than he could replenish it. But Marlene was failing too. His body had nothing left to give. His injuries were screaming, his muscles beyond exhaustion, his hands barely maintaining grip on his knife. He was operating on sheer will, and will could only sustain you for so long before reality caught up. 5 minutes of combat and both fighters were slowing. 10 minutes and Korvax's attacks had lost their initial speed, becoming more predictable. 15 minutes and he was gasping inside his helmet, his armor becoming a furnace that cooked him in his own sweat. 20 minutes and Marlene saw his opening. Korvax raised both swords for an overhead strike, a powerful attack that would split a man in half if it connected. The tyrant put his full weight into it, committing completely, seeking to end the fight with overwhelming force. Marlene moved at the last instant, the swords crashing down on stone with enough force to chip the floor. In that moment, while Korvax was overextended and off balance, Marlene struck, but not with his knife, with his last arrow, the one he'd kept hidden in his belt for exactly this moment. He threw the arrow like a dart, his aim perfect despite exhaustion. The stone arrowhead struck the mechanical fastening at Korvax's neck, the complex clasp that held his gorget in place. The mechanism shattered under the impact, destroyed by precisely applied force, and the heavy armor piece fell away. Blue skin was exposed, vulnerable, just for a moment. But a moment was all Marlene needed. He closed the distance before Korvax could recover, before the tyrant could bring his guard up, before reality could reassert itself. His long knife, bloodied and battered but still sharp, drove into the exposed throat. The blade went in horizontally, severing trachea and both carotid arteries. Then Marlene twisted and ripped sideways, opening the wound wide. Korvax dropped his swords, his hands going to his throat in an instinctive but futile attempt to stop the bleeding. Blood poured between his fingers, impossibly bright in the throne room light. He tried to speak but only managed wet gurgling sounds. His eyes met Marlene's, and in them was surprise, disbelief. The shock of someone who'd never truly believed he could be killed. The tyrant fell to his knees, then forward onto his face. His body twitched twice, his brain function deteriorated, then was still. Korvax was dead. The throne room went absolutely silent. The guards stared at their fallen lord, at the human who looked like death himself, but still stood while their master lay in spreading blood. Marlin turned to face them, his bloody knife ready, and waited to see if anyone wanted to continue. No one did. One by one, they laid down their weapons, some from fear, some from relief, some from the cold calculation that a new power had emerged, and opposing it was pointless. Rubena walked forward, stepping over her uncle's body without looking at it, her small face composed despite everything. She climbed the throne and stood on it, her small body somehow commanding despite her size. "I am Rubena of the royal line," she announced, her voice clear and strong. "My uncle is dead. His tyranny is ended. Any who swear loyalty to me will be granted mercy and the chance to rebuild. Any who refuse will be hunted and judged. Choose now." The guards knelt, some immediately, others more slowly, but all eventually. They recognized the change in power, the transfer of authority. Some would remain loyal out of genuine belief. Others would serve until they found opportunity to betray. That was the nature of power, and Rubena would have to learn to navigate those waters herself. Marlene wiped his knife clean on Korvac's cloak, his movements mechanical. His wounds were bleeding again, his vision swimming from exhaustion and blood loss. But he remained standing, maintaining his guard until the situation was truly resolved. Rubena came to him as the guards began organizing themselves, her face showing emotions she'd kept buried for days. Relief, grief, triumph, fear, all washing over her in waves now that the immediate threat had passed. "Stay," she said quietly, her voice almost pleading. "Be my protector, my general. You can have anything you want. Power, wealth, position. I will give you everything. Please don't leave." Marlin was quiet for a long moment, looking at the small blue child who had hired him to kill a devil and had watched him do it. She needed protection, needed guidance, needed someone who could keep her safe while she rebuilt a broken kingdom. But he couldn't be that person, couldn't be anyone's guardian or general or symbol of power. That's not what he was built for. "You don't need a hunter anymore," he said finally, his voice rough. "You need wisdom. You need advisors who understand governance. You need people who can build rather than destroy. That's not me. I'm good at killing things, at surviving in places that want me dead. That's all I'm good at." "Then what will you do?" Marlin looked toward the windows where the sun was beginning to rise, painting the mountains in shades of orange and gold. Somewhere out there, the wild lands waited, beasts to hunt, challenges to face, the simple clarity of survival without the complications of civilization. "My home is where the beasts hide," he said. "Your home is here, rebuilding what your uncle destroyed. You can do that. I've seen your strength. You survived when everything tried to kill you. That's harder than anything else you'll face. Will I ever see you again? Maybe. If you need something killed that no one else can kill, if there's another devil that needs truth." He managed something that might have been a smile. "Try not to need that. The world has enough devils." "What was your family name?" she asked, trying to hold on to some connection. Marlin paused at the door, his hand on the frame for support. "I had one once. Don't remember it anymore. Names don't matter in the wild, only what you can survive." "Then I will call you what my people call you, the Pale Spirit. Call me whatever you want. Just rule better than your uncle. Build something worth protecting. Otherwise, I might have to come back, and neither of us wants that." He walked out of the throne room, his limp pronounced now, blood leaving a trail behind him. Through corridors and halls, past guards who moved aside with something like reverence or fear. Out into the morning air, where the sun was painting the sky in colors that had no names. Word had already spread. The tyrant was dead. The human had killed him. The little princess lived. People were emerging from their homes. Slaves were dropping their tools. Guards were laying down their weapons. The entire structure of power was collapsing, and something new would have to be built from the ruins. Marlene walked through it all without stopping, heading for the gates, heading for freedom. People moved aside as he passed, some bowing, some just staring. The pale spirit, the impossible creature who had done what no army could accomplish. He retrieved his cached equipment from various hiding spots throughout the mountains, checking each piece methodically. His bow was intact. His tools were where he'd left them. Good. The world was still making sense. By midday, he was kilometers away, following game trails into the deep wilderness. His wounds would heal, given time and rest. His strength would return. And somewhere in these wild mountains, there would be beasts that needed hunting, employers that needed his skills, and the simple clarity of survival without politics or power or responsibility. Behind him, in the citadel, Rubena stood on her throne and began the hard work of building a kingdom from tyranny's ruins. She was 5 years old, orphaned and traumatized, but she'd learned from the best teacher. Survive first, adapt constantly, never assume safety. Build what you can from what you have. Marlene made camp that night beside a crystal stream, roasting meat from a small creature he'd trapped with practiced ease. The moon rose, casting pale blue light across the landscape. Tomorrow he'd find work. There was always work for someone who could kill what others feared. He touched the fresh scars on his side, his arm, his hands, his feet. Each one was a lesson learned, a mistake that wouldn't be repeated. The planet had tested him repeatedly, and he'd passed each test by being harder to kill than everything else. That was the secret to survival, not being the strongest or the fastest or the smartest, just being too stubborn to die. In the distance, something howled. Marlene smiled and settled in for the night, alone again, exactly as he preferred. Out here in the wild, things made sense. You were predator or prey, strong or weak, living or dead. No politics, no complications, just the honest brutality of nature. Years would pass, stories would spread. Tales of the human who killed a tyrant for a child's plea, who walked untouched through death itself, who needed neither armor nor army, just will and blade and the cold clarity of purpose. Merchants would whisper his name in trading posts. Warriors would tell stories of his impossible feats. Children would dream of being half as brave, half as deadly, half as free. But Marlene himself would remain what he'd always been, a hunter, a survivor, a man who'd lost everything on one world and rebuilt himself into something harder on another. He'd become the pale spirit, the ghost that walked through death, and in becoming that, he'd found a kind of terrible freedom. And when the next impossible job came along, when someone needed a devil killed for truth, they would know where to look. The wild places, where the beasts hide, where the pale spirit walked alone, forever hunting, forever surviving, forever free. The moon wheeled overhead in its eternal path, indifferent to human concerns. The stream burbled its endless song. The mountains stood silent and watching, ancient beyond measure. And somewhere in that vast wilderness, a scarred human slept lightly with one hand on his knife, ready for whatever tomorrow brought. Because tomorrow always brought something. And Marlene would face it the same way he'd faced everything else, with cold competence, brutal efficiency, and the absolute refusal to stop breathing. That was survival. That was freedom. That was enough.